Productions here, and I'm back with a review of this, a Hornby T9. Now, I got this at what I would consider a bargain price of £90, brand new, plus £4.95 postage. Now, to those of you unfamiliar with this locomotive, you may be thinking, for such a small engine, seems quite a high price. Well, clearly you haven't seen the recommended retail price of Hornby's most recent release. So, doesn't seem that expensive anymore. So the version I have is R3457 SR440 Class T9 number 116. I got this locomotive intentionally because I knew it was one of the newer versions with the permanent drawbar connection. It comes in the usual block of ice packaging with the outer sleeve. Chuck that. And carefully get the locomotive out. Oh, and there goes the paperwork. So these are just the operating and maintenance instructions that go over the usual business, running in, locomotive maintenance, lubrication, body removal and whatnot. So yeah, pretty standard. So the outer sleeve comes off. We've got the detail pack. There's not too much in here. We've got brake rigging, an extra tension lock coupler for the front. I'm not sure what that is for the rear. You take off the coupling and put that on. I'm not sure what it is actually. I have also noticed though, we do have screw link couplings, which is a very nice touch. Onto the locomotive herself. Oof. And then... Ooh. Now I tend to hold the locomotive with the tender and actually the lower portion of the smoke box, because as you'll see later, she is a bit delicate. Oh no! I've gone and trapped myself in the packaging. Okay. Whew. Got out of that. Just get rid of that styrofoam. So, let me compose myself and we'll get on with the review. So, sadly, before we get into the review, I do need to have a bit of a rant. Now, I'm grateful because I didn't pay the full recommended retail price of this locomotive, but even at £95, there is a fundamental issue. It's too light. Despite having that die-cast boiler, she only weighs 210 grams, which is lighter than my Hornby J15, and shockingly, it's lighter than this. So, sadly, Hornby, in order to mitigate this, has fitted the T9 with traction tyres, which is such a shame because personally I feel, especially for the current retail price, they could have very easily have made the splashers die cast, they could have made the cab die cast, and that would have easily have put more weight over the driving wheels, and in my opinion you could have got rid of the traction tyres completely. Additionally, model manufacturers such as Bachmann and Dapple have introduced traction tyres on their models, but have at least provided an additional set of wheels that don't have traction tyres. So, especially for the current versions, I think Hornby could definitely add those, because as you'll see later, they do have an interesting impact on the locomotive's performance. Additionally, there are aspects of this model that are far too delicate. I kid you not, I despise handling this model. I find the best way to hold it is the lower portion of the smoke box and from the tender, because these handrails, despite being made of metal, are incredibly delicate, and this pipe work that runs along the running plate is made of plastic, and as you can see, it flexes rather horribly, well, in places, especially at the front here, that's just ugh. And for some bizarre reason, rather than being made of a moulded plastic that's the same colour as the loco, it's painted, and as a result of me initially holding the locomotive by the running plate, some of the paint has sadly peeled off. Rant over, this is a stunning model. It's absolutely perfect. When I took this out of the box, I was terrified thinking that there's going to be bits falling off, glue marks all over the place, I'm going to have to do repairs, even return it maybe, but thankfully, as you can see, she's absolutely immaculate. The livery application is just stunning. It's so precise. There's hardly any paint bleed at all, and I think the only slight bit I can see is over the front splash, and even then, you have to be looking incredibly closely. All the lettering and lining and the numbering has been applied beautifully crisply. And just the build quality of the locomotive, despite some of the parts being rather delicate, is incredible. Let's get on to some of the details. The locomotive has separately fitted metal handrails, which are extremely fine, slightly on the delicate side, but they're still very good quality. The locomotive has lots of separately fitted pipework. It is all plastic, however, on my example at least, it does look very convincing. Between the boiler and frames, we have a beautiful representation of the internal motion, and it just looks stunning. When this locomotive is running, it just catches your eye, and it just looks beautiful. Additionally, on the smoke box, we have an array, and I mean an array of separately fitted parts, which include the lampines and the completely separately fitted smoke box dart. Sadly, despite there not being any visible massive glue marks, there is perhaps an indication that Hornby has used slightly cheap quality glue, because as we can see around the front lampines and the front splasher, there is a little bit of frosting, which, as I say, is perhaps the result of cheap quality glue, not necessarily too much. We do have separately fitted metal safety valves, and they have a beautiful shine. It does, however, contrast the plastic pipework, but as I say on my example, the moulding and the paintwork is very, very nice. The tender is definitely worth your attention. It is such a beautifully quaint and even quirky design. Drummond introduced the 8-wheeled watercart tenders as an alternative to the 6-wheeled ones, and as far as I know, they actually became standard for the locomotives. And I'm not sure if you can see on camera, but Hornby have actually moulded the springs there behind the wheels. So it's an incredibly detailed piece considering it's not even powered. The tender is also fitted with a red turning wheel. I'm fairly certain that'll be the handbrake for the tender. And we have a removable coal load, if I can remove it. And removing the coal load reveals that Hornby have fully represented the top of the tender, which is an excellent feature. The model is also complete with sprung buffers, and they have a nice bit of spring to them. And the finish on the boiler is actually quite nice, and I attribute that to the die-cast, the fact that it's made of die-cast. Now let's move on to objectively the best feature of this model. The cab windows are glazed separately, which is a very premium feature. We have a separately fitted metal tender foreplate, which is quite a nice touch. Now, when I was watching Sam's Trains video, he seemed to complain about the height of the foreplate and the fact that it wasn't adjustable. However, when you close couple the locomotive with the tender, it actually matches the height of where the fireman would shovel the coal. So, as far as I can understand, that's actually prototypical. So, the cab is complete with very fine separately fitted handrails. And as you can see, it is absolutely phenomenal. I mean, first of all, the number of separately fitted parts. I mean, that regulator, the brake handle, the gauges are separately fitted and made out of transparent plastic. It just looks incredible. The dials are picked out, and it honestly, if I had a microscope, it looks as if I could actually read them. I've already mentioned the separately glazed windows. It's an incredible cab. The level of precision and detail, it's all perfectly fitted. There's no glue marks or sloppy jobs done here. It's incredible. Some of Hornby's more recent locomotives haven't had cabs like this, so it just makes you think. So, enough gushing over the detail of this locomotive. Let's get it onto the track and give her a test run. So here she comes. I've already ran her in because when I first got the locomotive I wanted to make sure she was perfectly fine and didn't need returning. As you can see here, that wasn't the case. So mechanically this locomotive is very good. Every single wheel on this locomotive has pickups, which is extraordinary, and that includes the tender and every single one. The locomotive has a 5-pole skew-wound motor, no flywheel, however the gearing does seem to mitigate against any cogging. However, the traction tyre, as you will see, does have an interesting effect on the slow speed. Now this may just be my example, however, considering this locomotive doesn't have a flywheel, it probably explains why. As mentioned before, the locomotive doesn't have any flywheel, however, the main issue, and this is my personal main grievance against traction tyres, as you will see, it exacerbates any judderiness in the mechanism. Let's bring it back in reverse. It's such a shame because what would otherwise be a very decent crawl is ruined by the traction tyres, because of course the friction causes the locomotive to judder excessively. I mean, you can even hear the tender. I'm not sure if you can hear that from the camera. So it is a bit of a shame. A locomotive without traction tyres would essentially wheel slip a little bit, and that would create the illusion that it isn't juddering as much. So this is my personal grievance against traction tyres, not necessarily due to lazy manufacturing, although that is part of it, but because it has the potential to ruin the slow speed of a locomotive. Now, of course, once the locomotive gets up to speed, that goes away, but it is a shame. It does mean that when the locomotive is starting from a stop, especially in reverse, because of that tender. So another issue with this locomotive, and I certainly hope for many people's sanity that it's not a recurring issue with the T9s, were the tender pickups. Now, when I was running this locomotive in, I noticed that some of the tender wheels weren't actually rotating, so I lubricated the axles and I got the impression that that would just get rid of any issues. It didn't. So my deduction was then that the tender pickups must be pressing too hard against the wheels, and they were. So I had to disassemble the lower chassis of the tender, and let me tell you, that is not a nice thing to do. And I adjusted the pickups, did that, the wheels were mostly turning, however the centre two was still causing trouble, and then it had developed a horrible squeaking noise. I had to disassemble the tender again to adjust the pickups again, which required removing that ever so delicate plug from the locomotive to tender. And finally now the wheels rotate freely. All I will say is I certainly hope Hornby have sorted that out for their most new release, because goodness gracious me, that was not a pleasant task to undertake. Besides that though, she is a beautiful smooth runner. At the slightly higher speeds, she can run very, very well, and because of all the pickups, continuity with the track is wonderful. She's got pretty decent gearing. I was hoping that my example would be similar to Sam's trains, where it seemed to be running a bit slower than previous versions. So I'll just bring her in at 50% speed. Oh, reverse. As you can see, that's not too bad. These locomotives were known as greyhounds, so perhaps a slightly fast speed is alright. So yeah, the main issue again with the traction tyres is the friction. You do have quite a sudden stop, and again because of a lack of flywheel, but otherwise a very, very good runner. Anyway, enough rambling on. I'll get this hooked up to some coaches and we'll have a good old-fashioned running session. Now, I know exactly what half of you are thinking.
Goods train, a goods train, a goods train, he grumbled. The shame of it, the shame of it, oh, the shame of it.
I don't have any southern coaches, and I'm saving my Pullmans for another running session that I'll be doing, so stay tuned for that. Without a shadow of a doubt, this is the most gorgeous locomotive I own, and I am so pleased that I managed to get it at such a good price. It does have its flaws, but for a locomotive like this with such a beautiful livery, incredible detail, and with my example, very, very good build quality, an excellent mechanism, and just overall, when you think of a quintessential Victorian locomotive, this is what you think of, a 440, and it's just wonderful. In conclusion, if you can get one at a good price and make sure to get the newer version with the permanent drawbar connection, I'd wholeheartedly recommend it. Thank you so much for bearing with my waffles. Make sure to like this video if enjoyed, comment your thoughts down below, and I'd really appreciate it if you could subscribe. Bye for now.